He was a poor single father with two children. She was a millionaire CEO. Their meeting began on the side of the road and changed everything. The road stretched out in a long ribbon of cracked asphalt, the late afternoon sun sinking low and burning orange against the horizon. Michael Hayes drove with one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on the worn seat beside him where his daughter, Lily, leaned against the window. His son, Jake, sat in the back with a backpack at his feet, staring out at the endless fields. The twins were quiet as they usually were after school. Two 9-year-olds who had already learned that silence often kept the world easier for their father. The old pickup rattled and coughed, every bump in the road shaking its tired frame. Michael knew the truck wasn't meant for many more years, but it was all he had. He was thinking about bills, about the part he needed for the garage, about how he was going to keep dinner simple yet filling, when Lily's soft voice broke the hum of the engine. "Dad," she said, pointing ahead, "look." Up the road, dust shimmered around a car pulled over onto the shoulder. Not just any car, a glossy black sedan, the kind of machine that didn't belong on these empty country roads. The hood was propped open, steam curling into the air, and beside it stood a woman. Even from a distance, Michael could tell she didn't belong here. Her blue coat caught the light, her posture straight and tense. She looked like someone dropped from a different world, standing helpless in the middle of nowhere. "Poor lady," Lily murmured, her brow creasing with concern. "Yeah," Michael muttered, slowing the truck as they passed. He glanced at his rearview mirror, saw her looking around as if the road itself might offer her a solution. He could have kept driving. Someone else might come along, someone more fitting for her world. But then Jake leaned forward from the back seat, his voice quiet but certain. "Dad, we should stop." Michael sighed, the kind of heavy exhale that carried years of exhaustion. Stopping meant time, and time was something he never had enough of. But when he caught the earnest eyes of his children in the mirror, he felt the weight of his own lessons pressing on him. What kind of father would he be if he didn't show them that help mattered, even when it was inconvenient? He flicked on the blinker and pulled onto the shoulder. The twins watched as he climbed out, his boots crunching against gravel. The heat hit him immediately, thick and sticky, carrying the metallic bite of a struggling engine. The woman turned at the sound of his footsteps. Up close, she was younger than he expected, no older than 28. Her blonde hair was pulled back, strands loose around her face, and her brown eyes held frustration mixed with a kind of quiet pride, like she wasn't used to being seen vulnerable. "Car trouble?" Michael asked, his voice steady, plain. She exhaled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "It just died on me. I called roadside service, but they said it would be at least an hour, and She stopped herself, pressing her lips together, as if she didn't want to admit she was stranded. Michael leaned over the hood, inhaling the familiar scent of coolant and heat. "Mind if I take a look?" Her hesitation lasted only a second before she nodded. He rolled up his sleeves, ignoring the grime that smeared instantly against his forearm as he checked connections and lines. His hands moved with practiced ease, the motions of a man who had been fixing things his whole life. Behind him, Jake and Lily climbed out of the truck, watching curiously from a few steps away. The woman's gaze flicked toward the children. "They're your—" she asked. "Yeah," Michael answered without looking up. "Jake and Lily." Lily gave her a shy smile, and for the first time the woman's expression softened. She bent slightly, lowering herself to the girl's level. "I'm Emily," she said gently. Lily's face brightened as though the name itself was a secret gift. After a few more minutes, Michael closed the hood with a solid thud. "Try it now," he said, stepping back. Emily slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine roared back to life, smooth and steady. Relief washed across her face, and when she climbed back out, she looked at him with something like disbelief. "You just fixed it?" Michael shrugged, wiping his hands on the back of his jeans. "Old cars, new cars. It's all bolts and wires. You just have to listen." For a moment, their eyes met. Hers were deep brown, shimmering in the late sunlight. His were dark, tired, but honest. Neither said anything more. "Thank you," she finally whispered. Michael only nodded, motioning for his kids to climb back into the truck. He didn't ask for her name again, didn't wait for gratitude beyond what she'd already given. He was used to helping, then moving on. But as he drove away, Lily leaned against the window, watching the figure of the woman grow smaller in the mirror. "Dad," she murmured. She looked lonely. Michael gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes on the road. Yeah, he said quietly. She did. And though he tried to push the thought aside, the image of her, the blonde woman in the blue coat by the broken car, stayed with him long after the road stretched empty behind them. Emily Carter sat behind the wheel long after the man's truck disappeared down the stretch of asphalt, the sound of his engine fading into the quiet hum of cicadas. The sedan purred steadily now, as if nothing had ever been wrong with it, but her hands lingered on the steering wheel, unmoving. She wasn't used to strangers fixing things for her. She wasn't used to strangers at all. At 28, Emily had become a name whispered in boardrooms and splashed across business magazines. The youngest female CEO in her firm's history, a millionaire who turned opportunities into empires. She had mastered the art of walking into rooms where no one wanted her and leaving them silenced with her decisions. Her life was tailored navy suits, endless contracts, glass offices that hovered above the city like fortresses. But here, on a cracked country road, she had felt utterly powerless until a man with calloused hands and weary eyes bent over her car as if it were nothing more than a puzzle to solve. And those eyes, Michael's eyes, had unsettled her. They hadn't lit with recognition, hadn't calculated what they could take from her, hadn't sought the weight of her last name. They had simply looked at her and then at the engine, as if she were just a person who needed help. She couldn't remember the last time she had been seen that way. She drove the rest of the way to her hotel in silence, her thoughts wandering back to the children. Twins, he'd said, Jake and Lily, 9 years old, standing there patiently while their father worked. She had caught the protective way Jake's hand held his sister's, the shy bravery in Lily's smile. Something about the picture they made, a worn-out truck, two kids who belonged to no one but their father, a man who didn't hesitate to help her, lodged itself in her mind. That night, in the suite that overlooked the glowing city skyline, Emily sat at the edge of her bed with her laptop open, spreadsheets and projections glowing across the screen. Numbers usually steadied her, gave her control, but she found herself staring instead at her reflection in the dark window. Blonde hair in loose waves, brown eyes that looked far older than 28, lips pressed thin with fatigue. She thought of the girl Lily's voice, soft, kind, unguarded, and realized she couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at her without expectation. For Michael, the evening was different, but no less restless. His small house creaked with the familiar sounds of settling wood. Jake worked quietly at the kitchen table on his homework, pencil scratching against paper. Lily colored beside him, her crayons spilling across the worn surface. Michael washed dishes, his hands moving automatically, but his thoughts wandered back to the roadside. He had fixed dozens of cars in his life, helped strangers when he could, but this had felt different. She hadn't belonged on that road, in that world of dust and failing engines. She had looked like someone from a photograph, untouchable, perfectly put together. Yet when her eyes had met his, there had been something raw there, something that didn't match the coat, the sedan, the polished exterior. Jake broke the silence. Dad, who was that lady? Just someone whose car broke down, Michael said. He kept his voice steady, but he felt the weight of the memory pressing in. She was pretty, Lily added with the innocent certainty of a child. Then she looked at him with those clear eyes that reminded him too much of their mother. She smiled at me, like she wanted to be our friend. Michael dried his hands on a rag, turned off the sink, and forced a small smile. Sometimes people smile just to be polite, Lily. But as he tucked his children into bed later that night, he couldn't shake the image of Emily standing beside her silent car, the frustration and pride on her face, the gratitude in her voice when she whispered thank you. Across town, Emily closed her laptop and lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. She should have been preparing for the meeting the next day, for negotiations that could shift millions of dollars. Instead, her thoughts circled around a stranger's voice, rough but kind, saying, "Old cars, new cars. It's all bolts and wires. You just have to listen." For the first time in a long time, she felt the cracks in the life she had built, the walls she had reinforced with money and control. And in those cracks lingered the echo of a roadside encounter with a man and his children. An encounter that, she knew without understanding why, she wouldn't be able to forget. The following week brought with it a restless rhythm for both of them, though neither would have admitted it aloud. For Michael, the days were filled with grease-stained hours at the garage, bending over engines while the radio muttered static-filled country songs in the background. He worked hard because there was no other choice. Rent, groceries, and the twins' school supplies didn't wait for miracles. Yet even as his hands tightened bolts and traced wires, his mind kept drifting back to the woman on the roadside. He told himself it was nothing, just a fleeting encounter, but the memory of her eyes kept cutting through the noise of his daily grind. For Emily, the week was no easier. She walked into her company's headquarters, towering glass and steel rising into the clouds, the weight of her position pressing heavier than usual. Her assistant rattled off a list of meetings, acquisitions, and investor calls, each one stacked upon the next. She signed documents that moved millions with the flick of her pen, her voice cool and measured as she commanded rooms full of older men who still doubted her authority. She had fought to be here, fought harder than anyone had ever expected. And yet, when the doors of her office closed and the city lights stretched beneath her window, she found herself haunted not by numbers or contracts, but by the sound of a stranger's voice saying, "You just have to listen." It was during one of those late evenings that fate decided to stitch their worlds together again. Michael had promised the twins a rare treat, dinner at a diner near the edge of town, a place with neon lights and booths that smelled faintly of coffee and syrup. It wasn't much, but for Jake and Lily, it was a celebration. They slid into the booth, their laughter bubbling in a way Michael hadn't heard in too long. He felt lighter for the first time in weeks, the simple joy of his children filling the cracks of his tired soul. Emily entered that same diner an hour later, accompanied by two of her executives. The polished sheen of her presence seemed almost out of place in the cramped little room, where truckers nursed mugs of coffee and families shared plates of fries. She had insisted on meeting here, far from the city's glare, because she wanted to see the property they were considering acquiring. A small strip of land that included, ironically, the garage where Michael worked. Their eyes met across the diner before either could prepare for it. Michael, seated with his children, froze with a fork halfway to his mouth. Emily, in her tailored suit, stopped mid-sentence, her lips parting slightly in shock. For a heartbeat, the room around them blurred, the hum of conversation fading until there was only recognition. Lily noticed first. "Dad," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "It's her." Emily excused herself from her colleagues with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She crossed the room, her heels soft against the linoleum, and stopped at their booth. Jake straightened instantly, protective as always, his young shoulders squaring beside his sister. "Michael," she said softly, almost as if testing his name on her tongue. He set down his fork, his voice rough with surprise. "Emily." For a moment they just looked at each other, and then Emily's gaze shifted to the twins. Her expression softened, melting the steel of her professional mask. "Jake." "Lily. It's good to see you again." The children smiled, though Jake's was cautious. Lily, braver, asked, "Are you our friend now?" Emily's laugh was quiet, almost fragile. "I'd like to be." Michael studied her, suspicion warring with something else he didn't want to name. She was out of place here, too polished, too wealthy, too far from his world. And yet there was no denying the way his children leaned toward her, drawn to the warmth in her voice. He cleared his throat, trying to shake the tension. "What brings you to a place like this?" Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Work," she admitted. "We're considering acquiring some land nearby." Michael's jaw tightened. He knew instantly what that meant. His garage, his livelihood, the little patch of earth that kept his children clothed and fed. The irony cut sharp. Of all the people in the world, she had to be the one holding the papers that could end his stability. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken truths. Emily saw the shift in his expression, the way his shoulders stiffened, and realization dawned in her eyes. "Your garage," she whispered. He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. The silence was confirmation enough. For the rest of the evening, Michael tried to mask his turmoil for the twins' sake. He smiled at their jokes, nodded along to their chatter, but every time his gaze drifted, it collided with Emily's across the diner. Her colleagues eventually left, but she stayed a while longer, as if anchored by something she didn't understand. When Michael finally ushered his children toward the door, Emily stood near the counter, her coat draped over her arm. Their eyes met one last time. He wanted to be angry, to dismiss her as just another wealthy executive who didn't care about the lives crushed beneath contracts. But instead, he saw something else in her gaze: hesitation, conflict, and a loneliness that mirrored his own. He held his children's hands tighter as they stepped out into the night air, the neon light buzzing above them. He told himself that she was trouble, that her world and his should never collide again. But deep down, beneath all the walls he had built, he already knew the truth. Their lives were colliding, whether he liked it or not. And Emily, standing alone in the diner, felt the same gnawing certainty. This was only the beginning. The night after the diner meeting was one of the longest Michael could remember. Sleep never came easily to him, but that night it felt impossible. He lay awake in the small creaking house, staring at the ceiling while his mind replayed the same image again and again. Emily Carter standing there in her perfect suit, telling him that her company was preparing to buy the land under his garage. The same woman whose car he had fixed on the roadside. The same woman who had looked at his children with a softness that seemed genuine. He wanted to hate her. He needed to. But hatred didn't come easily, only confusion. Down the hall, Jake and Lily whispered to each other before drifting to sleep. He could hear their voices, the faint laughter that carried innocence he fought so hard to protect. For them, he needed to fight. For them, he couldn't afford to lose the garage. That was the last tether holding their fragile life together. Without it, there would be no rent, no food, no stability. And now the threat to all of it came not from some faceless executive, but from her. Emily didn't sleep much either. Her penthouse suite on the top floor of a luxury hotel overlooked the city, glittering with lights like jewels scattered across black velvet. She had everything a person could want: wealth, power, influence. Yet as she stood at the massive window, she felt only emptiness. The memory of Michael's eyes across the diner wouldn't leave her. He hadn't looked at her the way most men did, with calculation or admiration or greed. He had looked at her like she was something dangerous, someone who could take everything from him. And for once, he wasn't wrong. She poured herself a glass of wine, trying to settle her thoughts, but the liquid only tasted bitter. She thought of Lily's words. "Are you our friend now?" Spoken with such innocent hope. The memory stung. She was not their friend. If she went forward with this acquisition, she would become their enemy. The following morning, Michael rose before the twins and drove to the garage. The sun was barely up, the air heavy with dew, but already his chest tightened at the sight of the property. It wasn't much, just a low building with peeling paint, an old sign barely hanging on, tools scattered like bones across the floor. But it was his. He had built a life out of it after his wife died, using these cracked floors and rusted lifts to keep his children fed. He ran his hand across the chipped paint of the doorframe and felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it made his teeth clench. When he walked inside, his business partner, an older man named Carl, looked up from beneath a hood. "You hear the news?" Carl asked grimly. "Big firm wants the land. Some Carter Corporation." Michael's jaw tightened. "Yeah," he muttered. "I heard." Carl shook his head. "They'll shut us down, Mike. We can't fight that kind of money." Michael swallowed hard, forcing steel into his voice. "I'm not letting them take this place without a fight." Later that day, Emily sat at a long conference table with her board members. Papers were spread across polished wood, maps of the region marked with red lines and circles. Executives spoke with the confidence of men who had never worried about feeding their children. To them, the garage was nothing but a square on a map, a line in a spreadsheet. "It's a clean acquisition," one of them said. "The land value alone is worth it. The businesses on it are negligible." Her eyes fell on the square that represented Michael's garage. Negligible. That was the word they used for his livelihood, for the place his children had run barefoot in the summers, for the building that held his life together. She heard his voice in her mind, rough, steady, tired, but unbroken. "We're a team." "Emily?" Another executive pressed, expecting her approval. She straightened in her chair, masking the turmoil within. "Continue with due diligence," she said coolly. Her voice was the one they expected, sharp and unflinching. But inside something cracked. That evening, she made a decision she hadn't planned. Instead of returning to her hotel, she drove back to the diner. The neon lights buzzed faintly, the smell of grease and coffee drifting out the door. She found Michael there again, sitting alone this time with a cup of coffee, grease still under his fingernails from the day's work. He looked up when she entered, his expression hardening instantly. She walked toward him, her heels clicking against the linoleum, and stopped at his table. "Why are you here?" he asked flatly. "Because I owe you an explanation," she said, her voice low. His jaw clenched. "You don't owe me anything. You're just doing your job. People like you always are." She flinched at the sharpness in his words but didn't back away. "I didn't know it was your garage when we started the process. I swear I didn't. And now you do." His eyes burned into hers. "So what happens next? Do you still take it? Do my kids get to watch me lose everything while you add another line to your portfolio?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him no, that she'd stop everything right now. But she also knew the weight of her board, the consequences of defiance. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I don't want to be your enemy, Michael." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Then maybe stop acting like one." He stood, tossed a few bills on the table for the coffee, and brushed past her without another word. Emily remained at the booth, her chest aching in a way no boardroom battle had ever made her feel. For the first time in her career, she realized she couldn't hide behind numbers and contracts. This wasn't business. This was human. As she sat there alone in the hum of the diner, she finally understood. The lines between her world and his weren't just crossing. They were colliding, and the wreckage would either destroy them both or build something neither had dared imagine. Michael had always believed that life tested him in quiet ways. The bills stacked on the counter, the roof that leaked every time it rained, the long hours that left his hands cracked and raw. But now the test had a face. Emily Carter. And every time he thought of her, something inside him twisted, not just with anger, but with the memory of the way she had looked at his children, the way Lily had smiled at her, the way Jake had leaned close as if measuring her carefully. They had liked her, trusted her, and that alone made the threat she carried cut deeper. The weeks that followed felt like a storm tightening around him. Word spread through the town about the acquisition. Some people whispered it with dread, others with resignation. Everyone knew what it meant. Small shops closed, jobs gone, the familiar stripped away. Michael's garage was the beating heart of that block. Without it, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He tried to keep the twins shielded. He kept his tone light at dinner, helped Lily with her math homework, listened to Jake talk about baseball, but they weren't blind. Children always saw more than adults wanted them to. One night, Jake set down his fork and asked quietly, "Dad, are we going to lose the garage?" Michael froze. He looked into his son's eyes, steady, searching, already too old for 9 years, and felt something inside him break. "Not if I can help it," he said finally. "That's our place. I'll fight for it." At the same time, Emily was fighting her own war. Every board meeting grew more hostile. The older men around the table had sharpened their smiles into knives. They praised her intelligence to her face while maneuvering behind her back, pushing for the acquisition harder than ever. To them, she was still the girl who had climbed too fast, who needed to be reminded where she stood. They wanted this deal. They wanted her compliance. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she could give it to them. At night in her penthouse, she found herself staring at the ceiling the same way Michael did, asking questions she had never allowed before. What was the point of millions if every choice she made hollowed her out? What was success if it meant crushing men like Michael and children like Jake and Lily? Her assistant delivered another stack of documents one morning, projections, financial models, timelines for bulldozers. Emily flipped through them, the words blurring until she finally closed the folder with trembling hands. She stood at the window looking down at the city she ruled and felt more like a prisoner than a queen. 2 days later, the confrontation came. Michael had been invited, though summoned felt closer to the truth, to a town hall meeting arranged by the company. He stood at the back of the crowded community center, his children sitting stiffly beside him, as executives in sharp suits made their case. Emily was there at the front, every eye trained on her. The room buzzed with anger. Neighbors shouted questions. "What about our jobs? What about the families you're putting on the street? Do you care at all?" Every word struck Emily like a stone, but she held her posture, her hands clasped, her voice calm as she gave answers, polished enough to satisfy shareholders but empty enough to enrage the people before her. Michael's chest burned. He could feel Jake tense beside him, Lily clutching his hand tightly. When Emily said the words, "The acquisition will move forward," cold, clinical, Nothing like the woman in the diner. Something inside him snapped. He pushed forward through the crowd until he was close enough to see the flicker in her eyes. "You're going to stand here and tell us this is just business?" His voice rang out, harsh and unfiltered. "You look at this community, at families like mine, and call us numbers on a page?" The room fell into a stunned hush. Emily's colleagues shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't look away from him. Her eyes locked on his, and for a split second the mask cracked. He saw it, the guilt, the hesitation, the war raging inside her. But then she straightened her shoulders, her voice steady as she answered. "I have to think of the company's future." Michael's laugh was bitter, sharp. "And what about ours? What about my kids?" He pulled Lily closer, his hand firm on Jake's shoulder. "We don't have golden parachutes, Emily. We don't have second chances when people like you decide our lives aren't profitable enough. All we have is this." The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily's face was pale, her hands trembling where no one could see. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she cared, that she hadn't meant for it to come to this. But the board members on either side of her watched like hawks, waiting for weakness. Michael turned, pulling his children with him, and pushed through the crowd toward the exit. Lily looked back once, her eyes wide, confused, hurt. Emily met that gaze and felt her chest tighten until she could hardly breathe. That night, Emily sat alone in her hotel room, the silence pressing heavy against her. She thought of Michael's words, of Lily's face, of Jake's steady eyes, and for the first time in her career, she realized she was standing on a cliff. One step forward meant keeping her throne, her wealth, her carefully built empire. One step back meant losing everything, except maybe, just maybe, finding herself again. And as the city lights blinked outside her window, Emily Carter understood that the choice was no longer about business. It was about who she was willing to become. Emily walked into the boardroom the next morning with her chest tight and her mind sharper than it had been in years. The floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the room with light, casting long shadows across the polished table where 12 men sat waiting. They looked up as she entered, some with thin smiles, some with impatience, all expecting the same thing they had always gotten from her: compliance dressed in confidence. She had once thrived here, standing at the head of this table, younger than most of them, more ambitious, more determined. But now the weight of their gazes felt like shackles. She thought of Michael standing in that community hall, his voice raw as he spoke for everyone who couldn't fight back. She thought of Lily's small hand clutching her father's arm, of Jake's steady, unblinking stare. The memory burned brighter than any number on their spreadsheets. One of the directors cleared his throat. "Emily, the community meeting was a predictable disaster. These people will complain, but it doesn't matter. Our lawyers have confirmed we're within our rights. It's time to finalize the acquisition and move forward." "Yes," another chimed in, leaning back in his chair. "The longer we wait, the more the press spins their sob stories. Let's keep control of the narrative, sign the papers, close the deal, and we'll be rid of this noise." Emily placed her briefcase on the table and slowly unlatched it. Inside wasn't the stack of contracts they expected, but folders filled with documents she had spent all night reviewing. Engineer memos warning of risks her company had buried. Letters from local business owners begging for extensions that had been ignored. Evidence of her board's long history of valuing profit over people. She slid the folders across the table. "These," she said, her voice calm but razor-sharp, "are the voices we've silenced. These are the people we've crushed because we thought they didn't matter. And I'm finished being part of it." The room stiffened. The oldest director narrowed his eyes. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying the acquisition is canceled," Emily said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Effective immediately. We will not take that land. We will not destroy families for another line in a report." A stunned silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Then came the storm. "You don't have the authority to unilaterally make that decision. This is emotional nonsense. You're jeopardizing millions, billions of shareholder value. Think carefully, Emily. One more misstep and you'll lose everything you've built." She stood taller, meeting each furious glare without flinching. "If I lose it, then I lose it. But I will not stand in front of another community and watch children look at me the way those children did last night." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. I've spent my life proving myself to people like you, thinking that climbing higher would finally make me free, but all I did was build myself a cage. I'd rather burn it down than keep living in it. The men erupted again, voices overlapping, some threatening, some mocking. But underneath the chaos, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in years: clarity. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She wasn't waiting for their approval. She had already made her choice. By the end of the day, the press had the story: CEO defies board, cancels multi-million deal. Cameras swarmed outside the building, reporters shouting her name, demanding answers. She gave them none. She walked out with her head held high, the cold November air biting at her cheeks, her heart pounding with both fear and exhilaration. Meanwhile, across town, Michael was bent under the hood of a car when Carl burst into the garage, holding a newspaper like it was on fire. "Mike, you won't believe this," Carl said, shoving the headline into his hands. Michael read it once, then twice, his brow furrowing as the words sank in. Emily had canceled the deal. She had stood against her own board. She had risked everything. For them. His first reaction wasn't relief but disbelief. It didn't make sense. Why would a woman like her, untouchable, rich, powerful, choose to fall on her sword for people she didn't even know? For him? For his children? That night, after he tucked Jake and Lily into bed, Michael sat at the kitchen table staring at the headline again. He remembered the way Emily had looked at him across the diner, the way her voice had trembled in the community hall, the way she had said, "I don't want to be your enemy." Maybe she wasn't. Emily, meanwhile, sat alone in her hotel room, stripped of all the noise. Her phone buzzed with missed calls, messages from colleagues, warnings from lawyers. She ignored them all. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her blonde hair falling loose, her brown eyes red from exhaustion. She had lost her company. She knew it. Tomorrow the board would vote her out. She would no longer be the youngest CEO in the industry. She would no longer be anyone's rising star. But for the first time in years, she felt free, terrified but free. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, as she thought of a man with calloused hands and two children who had looked at her as if she were more than a title, Emily Carter smiled through her tears. Whatever came next, she knew this: she had chosen right. The storm that followed Emily's decision was unlike anything she had ever experienced. By the next morning, her name was everywhere, splashed across headlines, dissected on financial news channels, whispered in corridors where power was traded like currency. Some called her brave. Others called her reckless. Most called her finished. The board wasted no time. They convened an emergency vote behind closed doors, voices raised and faces red as they argued not about whether she should remain, but about how swiftly they could cut her out. By evening, the verdict was unanimous. Emily Carter, the youngest CEO in the company's history, was ousted. She left the skyscraper she had once ruled with a cardboard box in her arms and the eyes of strangers watching from every corner. To them, she was a fallen star. To her, she was something she hadn't been in years: untethered. The hotel felt suffocating that night. Empty halls, a room too large and too sterile. Silence that pressed into her chest until she could hardly breathe. She paced between the window and the bed, her phone buzzing with calls she didn't answer. Investors demanding explanations, friends urging her to flee the city, journalists circling like vultures. She ignored them all. For once, she didn't want to manage the narrative. She wanted only to remember why she had chosen to burn everything down. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Michael read the news with disbelief. The story was everywhere. The CEO who had sacrificed her throne to protect a small-town garage and a handful of working-class families. People didn't do things like that. Not in his world, not in hers. He wanted to tell himself she'd done it for optics, to paint herself as a martyr, but the look in her eyes that night at the town hall, the tremor in her voice, told him otherwise. She hadn't acted for cameras. She had acted for something else, something real. The twins noticed the change in him. At dinner, Lily asked softly, "Dad, is she still our friend?" Michael froze with his fork in his hand. He should have told her no, that Emily belonged to a world they'd never touch again. But instead, he found himself saying, "Maybe." Later that week, he found her, not in the office towers, not at press conferences, but sitting alone in the same diner where they had locked eyes before. She was in a plain sweater this time, her hair loose, her face bare of the polish she usually wore. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. She looked younger, smaller, stripped of the armor of her title. She looked up when he slid into the booth across from her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the neon sign outside filled the silence, punctuated by the clink of dishes from the kitchen. "You lost everything," he said finally, his voice low but steady. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Not everything. I still have my name, though it's not worth much right now." He studied her, the curve of her shoulders, the exhaustion etched into her brown eyes. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why would you do it?" She met his gaze unflinching. "Because I couldn't keep pretending. Because when I saw your kids look at me like I was some kind of monster, it broke something in me. And because for the first time in years, I wanted to choose what was right, not what was profitable." Her words hung between them, heavy and raw. Michael felt something shift in his chest, something he didn't want to name. He had spent so long protecting himself from hope, from trust, from the possibility that anyone could mean what they said. Yet sitting across from her, he believed her. Against all logic, against all his better instincts, he believed her. "You're going to have a hard road," he said finally. "People don't forgive easily, especially not people with power." "I know," she whispered, "but maybe that's okay. Maybe I don't need their forgiveness." She hesitated, her voice softening. "Maybe I just need yours." Michael's throat tightened. He thought of Jake and Lily, of the way they had looked at her, the way Lily had called her a friend without hesitation. He thought of the long nights he'd spent alone, carrying the weight of fatherhood on his shoulders. And he thought of the strange, impossible truth, that this woman who had once been poised to take everything from him had instead sacrificed everything for him. He leaned back in the booth, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't know if I can give you that yet," he admitted, "but I can give you a chance." For the first time since the storm began, Emily smiled. Not the sharp, practiced smile of a CEO, but something real, something small and trembling. It was the kind of smile that said she didn't need victory, only hope. They sat there for hours, the plates cooling on the table, the world outside forgotten. Two people from different planets, bound by choices that had collided in ways neither had expected. By the time Michael stood to leave, the air between them had changed. It wasn't forgiveness yet, and it wasn't love, but it was possibility. And for both of them, scarred, weary, but still standing, that was enough. Winter settled in quietly, coating the streets with frost and turning the nights sharper. But for Michael and Emily, the weeks that followed were anything but still. Their lives had been torn open in different ways, his by years of hardship, hers by the collapse of everything she had built. And now they stood at the strange edge of something new. Neither fully trusted it, neither fully understood it, yet both kept stepping forward. Emily no longer had the endless schedules of meetings and investor calls. For the first time in her adult life, she had hours to fill, and at first those hours terrified her. She wandered the city without an entourage, rode in taxis instead of private cars, sat in cafes where no one recognized her. It was like waking from a dream only to realize she had forgotten how to live outside of it. But in those quiet, uncertain moments, she also discovered pieces of herself she hadn't known were missing. She began volunteering at small community centers, listening to people whose voices had never reached her glass office. She learned their stories, their struggles, and found herself wanting not to manage them, not to fix them from above, but simply to stand beside them. Michael kept working at the garage, patching up cars with the same determination as ever. But something in him had shifted too. He no longer felt like a man waiting for the ground to collapse beneath him. The threat had passed, not because of luck, but because someone had chosen to protect him when they had no reason to. That truth stayed with him. And though he tried to bury it beneath work and fatherhood, it rose up every time Emily appeared at the diner or walked into the garage with coffee in hand, her sweater sleeves pushed up, her hair a little messy. At first, the twins were cautious. Jake, protective and serious, watched Emily with suspicion, his small frame stiff whenever she came near. But Lily warmed to her almost instantly, her laughter bubbling out when Emily knelt to see her drawings or listened with rapt attention to her stories about school. Slowly, Jake softened too. One evening after Emily had stayed for dinner, he offered her a piece of pie without being asked. It was a small gesture, But for Michael, it was a sign as clear as sunlight. His children were letting her in. The townspeople, however, were not so quick to forgive. Some still muttered when they saw her, accusing her of playing some long con. Others treated her with open suspicion, unable to believe someone from her world could ever truly care about theirs. Emily bore it all quietly. She never defended herself, never explained. She only kept showing up, at fundraisers for the school, at volunteer shifts, at the diner where everyone could see her not as a CEO, but as a woman trying to belong. Michael admired her for that more than he could say. He had seen powerful people before, people who moved through the world untouchable, but Emily had done the unthinkable. She had let herself be touched. She had stepped down from her pedestal and walked into the mud beside the rest of them. That courage, different from the kind she wielded in boardrooms, was the one that captured him. One evening in early spring, as the frost finally began to loosen, Michael invited Emily and the twins to the lake, where he sometimes took them to fish. The water rippled quietly, reflecting the pale sky, and the children ran ahead with shouts of laughter, their footsteps scattering across the wooden dock. Emily stood beside him, her hands tucked into her pockets, her eyes following the children. "They look happy," she said softly. "They are," Michael replied. "They don't get much of this, just being kids." She turned to him then, her brown eyes warm in the fading light. "I didn't realize how much I had forgotten what that looks like. I spent so long chasing things that didn't matter. And now standing here," she broke off, shaking her head. "This matters more than any of it ever did." Michael studied her, the way the breeze caught her hair, the way her voice trembled with sincerity. He thought of all the nights he had stayed awake, wondering if he'd ever be enough for his kids, if he'd ever be more than a man patching holes in a sinking boat. And here she was, someone who had lost everything she thought defined her, yet who stood beside him as if this simple, quiet life was what she had wanted all along. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. It was a rough gesture, clumsy, uncertain, but she squeezed back with a certainty that steadied him. For a long time they stood like that, the sound of the children's laughter carrying across the water, the horizon glowing gold with the last light of day. Months later, no one in town was whispering anymore. They were watching Emily Carter, once a headline and now just a woman in jeans helping Jake with his science project. Watching Michael Hayes, once the tired single father, smiling more than anyone remembered. Watching Lily run across the schoolyard with a sketchbook Emily had given her, Jake tagging close behind. It wasn't a fairy tale. They still argued, Michael's stubborn pride clashing with Emily's fiery will. They still carried scars, his from years of loss, hers from betrayal and downfall. But they had built something together, brick by fragile brick. Until one evening at dinner, Lily set down her fork and said without hesitation, "I think she's our mom now." The table went silent. Emily froze, her hand hovering above her plate, her eyes wide. Jake gave a single solemn nod, and Michael's heart clenched so tightly he thought it might break. Slowly, Emily reached across the table, her hand trembling as she covered theirs. Her voice was barely a whisper, but every word carried the weight of truth. "If you'll have me," she said, tears brimming. And in that moment, the family they had all lost or longed for was finally complete. Later that night, as the children slept and the house settled into quiet, Michael and Emily sat together on the porch, the stars burning bright above them. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, and for the first time in years, he felt no fear about tomorrow. "You saved us," he said quietly. "No," Emily whispered, leaning into him. "You saved me." And with the night stretching endless before them, they both knew the truth. What had begun as a chance encounter on the side of a lonely road had become the road itself. The one they would walk together, hand in hand, into whatever future waited. What I love most about this ending is that it isn't about miracles or perfect coincidences. It's about choice. Michael didn't suddenly become wealthy, and Emily didn't win her throne back. But both of them learned to see value where once they had only seen survival or power. This is a story of two people from completely different worlds finding their way to one another. It's a reminder that real strength doesn't come from millions or titles, but from the courage to let go of old fears and trust something new. Michael showed that love can be stubborn and honest. Emily proved that even the strongest walls of money and success will crumble if they're empty inside. Their meeting on the roadside became a metaphor. Sometimes life breaks down exactly where you least expect it, and yet, in that breakdown lies a chance for a new family, for sincerity, for a future no longer chained to the past. To me, this story isn't only about love. It's about how happiness arrives when you stop living for the expectations of others and start living for those who look at you with trust.